Technically, the way to operationalize cognition would be to see it from a information processing perspective. So once I say information processing, it becomes almost all the stimuli that is hitting us, whether it is through our eyes or ear or nose or taste or skin, and that is the whole world in front of us. Eventually, we are all trying to solve a simple problem, and that is interpreting the world. And to do that, we have to process information. So for me, cognition is information processing in the mind.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of AskHowAbout. I'm your host, Pranay J. Reddy. Today, we're going to talk about something, or rather I am going to talk about something and you're going to listen about something which all of us experience. You know, it's happening right now. You're experiencing it and you can feel it, but you don't know about it. And no, I ain't talking about love. But then again, how would I know about it? But what I am talking about is cognition. Huh? Cognition? What do I mean by that? Well, it's the mental action of acquiring knowledge through your senses, thought, and experiences. Well, that is pretty key, isn't it? I mean, it's happening to you right now. I mean, you're looking at your little screen and you can see me talking and you're processing it and gaining knowledge and experiences through it. Can you hear me? And hell, it's AskHowAbout. So you're going to gain a whole lot of knowledge today. Our specialty. Now, if you pay careful attention to my definition of cognition, it's a huge deal. Like, not only about all things it's capable of, but also about the definition itself. Like, it involves experiences, our thoughts, our senses. Well, that's our whole mental makeup, if you think about it. And that's key to make our decisions. So all our decisions are some way or the other, directly or indirectly, based on our cognitive ability. So if you would ask me, if it's something was so important, I'd rather learn about it. Wouldn't you? So it's time, ladies and gentlemen. It's time we learnt about cognition. And hey, we are here to make sure that cognition is a little bit more easier for you guys to understand after this episode. So we have our expert today on cognition, Dr. Sumitava Mukherjee. His research areas include human judgment and decision making, cognitive processing, and human-centric technology. He has a doctorate in cognitive science from IIT Gandhinagar. He has 20 publications to his name and he has 2 awards as well. He is the associate editor in Frontiers in Psychology. He is a reviewer in multiple journals in psychology and management, and he is a member in various associations and societies. So that's a bit about our guest. Let's get on with the show. How you been, sir? How's the post-lockdown been treating you?
So the post-lockdown has been a long time, and I think we are slowly getting better to it. We are seeing more people smiling. We are seeing more people going out, having food, shopping, and I hope that most people are feeling better than what they were feeling during the lockdown. And that's the same thing for me too. Classes have started. I'm seeing student faces on the computer, though, but still it's better than seeing nobody around you. So hopefully all of us are feeling slightly better, and we should get better and better as we proceed over the next couple of months.
Well, that is honestly like seeing people itself. Even for me in online class, it's a big relief. Like, yes, there are other people going through the same problems I am. So that's a camaraderie which comes along. But the reason we have you on today, sir, you pretty much know it. It's about cognition, and even the things we went through during this lockdown, even right now, it's our mental ability is what's been most affected during this lockdown, during this social isolation period, if you can say so, or if you can call it that. And cognition has a big role, or rather, people blame it to cognition. So before we go into all that, I just want to know, in your definition, what is cognition? Or rather, what is cognition? I'm sorry for that. What is cognition?
Let me first tell you the kinds of definition that I have read on on Wikipedia, which is with all the problems still it is community edited. So there are at some point we are okay with what the Wikipedia is saying. Otherwise, somebody is going to change it. So from that democratization of knowledge perspective, it essentially says that cognition is a set of mental processes, and after it says it's a set of mental processes, it picks specific processes like reasoning, decision making, thinking, and that is echoed in many books also. That has led some people to believe that cognition mainly has to do with reasoning and decision making, whereas there are other psychological processes which have to do with emotion or attention or memory. Uh, but the way I have thought about cognition, I think it is it's a view that does not let you appreciate the richness of the word. For me, cognition, in a very subtle sense, is to say that it is every single mental process. There is nothing which is mental, but which is not cognition. That's how I have always thought about cognition. And technically, the way to operationalize cognition would be to see it from a information processing perspective. So once I say information processing, it becomes almost all the stimuli that is hitting us, whether it is through our eyes or ear or nose or taste or skin. And that is the whole world in front of us. Eventually, we are all trying to solve a simple problem, and that is interpreting the world. And to do that, we have to process information. So for me, cognition is information processing in the mind.
Okay, so the reason I wanted to first define or rather get your definition on cognition is because, like I said at the beginning, any problem any psychologist sees, it's a problem of the cognition. You know, that person's cognitive abilities is not up to par. So that's why I wanted to define it first, and also because any problem we face, it's because it's pointed towards cognition. And so your definition also kind of portrays that because you're saying it's about our information, how we collect or interpret information. So do you think all our problems somehow correlate or rather somehow, you know, indirectly or directly contribute to cognition or rather our incapability to become cognitively better?
So once we think of cognition as information processing, then I think that is all that we do all through our life. Right from the time you are born, or all of us are born, we are essentially processing information and interpreting it. And that, of course, uses information as a very strong word. That is a very, minor or a narrow definition of information in the engineering sense. But the way I am talking of information is pretty much everything. So that I'm not separating data from information, or I'm not using information theory, or Shannon's idea of information. I'm typically saying that all that is coming in is information, and what we are doing is we are interpreting it. Now that interpretation can be a news article, it can also be sunlight, it can also be a voice from a friend. So that enables us to treat every single thing as information. Now once we have a capability to process information, we all do it different way. I think sometimes we overdo or oversell this high cognition, or those who are more capable versus those who are less capable, and then we have devised all kinds of tests that we think measure that aspect of the human individual. But if you think about species in general, not just humans, every single species, including a bacteria or even a tree, is processing information, and they are all doing it. As long as you're able to do it well, you are going to survive. Once there's something of a problem either in your system or in the environment, you will not survive. So, but we humans have tried to measure different aspects of survival, and beyond that, we have tried to measure different aspects of performance. But then that performance has been measured from a yardstick of the one who has developed the test. And if we have ended up saying this person has a low IQ, high EQ, a low EQ, but does that really matter to the person to solve the daily problems? And you would see that there are people who would score very low on that test, but actually are very smart, or they are able to solve their problems very well. So I am always a little wary about these kinds of claims that we make about other cognitive abilities of people. But at the same time, it is true that we can train our minds, our brains, to become better at a certain task. And that could include critical thinking, it could analytical thinking, logical thinking. And many a times, there's a lot of research which shows that those who are very good in reasoning, for example, somebody who has higher capability of reasoning it out, is going to believe in fake news less than one who does not. Or somebody who has a bent to be more deliberative is not going to believe the price and quality heuristic, which means high price means this is going to be a great product. So these kinds of heuristics people don't believe in or don't follow if there are certain trainings that are given to the person. I don't really think that it cannot be done to certain person, which means that, okay, this is a person who is born like that. So this gifted individual's literature is very tricky and murky. What we do know is you can make people better at certain tasks, and clearly you can make people better at some mental tasks. Once people could become better at some mental tasks, that yields certain downstream effects. And that could include being able to control one better. Once you have a higher level of self-control, you probably are going to handle your anxiety better. You're probably going to eat better, exercise better, and also feel better, even in a lockdown. So that's the kind of deeper link that exists, and that I guess has to do with training the system up. And technically, there is no reason why an unknown person cannot be trained to feel equally good based on certain kinds of training programs that the person can themselves sign up for, or do it oneself, or maybe take some help. But I would be wary about saying there is a person who is low on cognition, and that is why that person is feeling not so good during the lockdown. The link is not that superficial. I think it is much more deeper through the training of memory systems or learning systems or decision making systems.
Well, that's very well informative answer, sir. But few aspects I wanted to focus on that was, you mentioned something about critical thinking and logical reasoning. Now, that is something we pride ourselves on. If you were to say like you're the most logical guy, like I'd be like, yeah, I am. I'd be proud about that. But emotion is key for all of us. So how would you relate emotion, or rather relation between emotion and cognition? How are they connected, or rather interconnected, or not connected at all?
Most textbooks I have seen, including books prescribed by certain boards in our country, they have different chapters, in fact different sections.
Okay.
And in one section they will say cognition, and one section they will say emotion. If you read the literature, all these words have always been used as a binary, as if they're fighting with each other. Or they would see people say these kinds of tasks are emotional, these kind of tasks are cognitive. So we are always taught this binary between what is cognitive is not emotional, and what is emotional is not cognitive. And I think over the last few years or decades of research in neuroscience, we have been shown that that's not true at all. What we do know now is if you look inside the brain, you would have a strong interconnected brain circuitry. And most brain circuitries across species, again, not just humans, they are based on an evolutionary chain. So one of the most fundamental things that's required for survival is emotion. And that is something which runs through all species. And that is also the deepest area in the brain, which is called the reward circuitry, which has striatum and nucleus accumbens and those kinds of brain areas, which the monkeys have, rats have, humans have, dogs have, cats have, tigers have, whales have, crocodiles have, snakes have. Right? So it runs across the animal kingdom, and also not just mammalian, also reptilian. So also, if you look at the evolutionary history of not a species, of evolution in general, you would find that, of course, we start off from a reptilian brain.
Right.
And in the reptilian brain's core is the emotional circuitry. So that, I think, is fundamental to survival. And emotion has served the biggest boost to helping a species survive. It cannot be derogatory. There are many people who have treated emotion as something which leads you off track, or which takes you away from the task. In fact, there is things called like hot cognition, which means it is emotional, and hence you ended up doing a mistake. Because you were emotional, you ended up doing an error. But emotion has not really taken us astray. If it would, then we would not have come to where we are. So the emotional circuitry, I think, is fundamental and one of the most important parts of any existence against across species. After that, we have developed something beyond it, which now we call the mammalian brain, which is the prefrontal cortex and the more modern developed brain areas. And what neuroscience has taught us now is if you look into the brain circuitry, there are strong interconnections, both forward and backward, between the emotion area and the higher order cognition or planning decision making area, which is the prefrontal cortex.
Right.
So when we are processing information, and this is a good part about treating cognition and information processing, you will see that the signals are going from the emotional area to the prefrontal cortex and back from the prefrontal cortex to the emotional area as a closed feedback loop, which means there is no way we can separate emotion from non-emotional process. Also, if you look at any stimuli, so people have told me these are emotional stimuli, and the example of emotional stimuli is a face. Okay, but what if it is a sanitizer today? Is it not emotional? What if I look at a price of a sanitizer? Is it not emotional?
Right.
Right? So I think that is absolutely impossible. In fact, even numbers, if you look at a specific number, which is supposed to be the least emotional part, it's not. We know if you show numbers to the brain and you record it, to the person you record the brain, you will find a lot of spikes for certain numbers. We like certain numbers. We love certain numbers. And that is why we buy houses or don't buy houses based on certain numbers. Even if you don't believe in numerology, you will still like the number which perhaps has to do with some close thing like your birthday or your first house or your mobile number, whatnot. So nothing really in this world perhaps is completely devoid of emotion. Some are of course has very low emotion. Like a random stone on the road might have very less emotion. Once you go and hit it, it will convert to some amount of emotion, depending on what happens to your leg. So but the more and more we have understood the brain, the more we have realized that cognition and emotion cannot be two separate things. It's a misnomer and it's a misbelief which has plagued our textbooks and our understanding a lot. And now it's high time to correct it and say, eventually you are doing information processing, which has different aspects to it. Some of it is going to be processed in certain areas of the brain more, and some other aspect of the same thing will be processed in certain other areas of the brain more. So the same stimuli, some aspect of that processing will happen in the emotional area, and some aspect of the processing will happen in some other area. I don't want to get into too many brain terms, but essentially different areas which is going to process different aspects of the same thing. And together, that has to be integrated for us to make sense of what that object is. And again, I have to plan how I am going to act on that object. Am I going to buy that sanitizer or not? Am I going to try it or not? Am I going to throw it away or not? So all of these have to do with this large brain circuitry, which eventually helps us act in the real world. And in the real world, you can't separate these words. These words typically has been academic separations for many, many reasons, including political. But there is necessarily no real reason for so much of diversification in the terms. And that helps you. I mean, you are able to do it once you go to the information processing approach that mainly happens in cognitive science, where we essentially treat everything as information processing, and hence we are able to look at different aspects of processing based on which area of the brain or which area of the part of the stimuli I want to focus on.
Well, so far what we looked at is so in terms of cognition, it's about information collecting and processing, and emotion and those are very much interrelated. Now, when it comes to real world, looking and feeling, collecting is one part of it, but we also have to act on it. Whether it just be sitting idle or even running towards something, it's still an action which we are constantly making. That's a decision or judgment we are making based on our cognitive abilities. So when it comes to decision making, how much does cognition in terms of logical thinking and emotion, which is, like you said, a far more predated or rather much more, let's say, conserved region of our brain, how much do they struggle or rather gain in terms of which parts make the decision best for us?
This is a question which has generated thousands and thousands of papers over the last 100 years. In fact, there are people who have argued about this from as long back I've read about papers. It dates back to philosophical arguments about exactly the same thing. Because eventually, this is a question about rationality. And the rationality is what defines human sciences, or rather humanity in general. And rationality has always been debated from these two perspectives, which eventually has to converge on saying what is a good decision. Because eventually we all want to make good decisions.
Right.
Whether it is about, again, the sanitizer example, I'm just using sanitizer because it's the
It's the
most in
most
thing now.
relevant thing right now. So I mean,
Yes. And all companies are now building sanitizers and masks.
yeah.
So, it also has a market value. Anyway, um, but, jokes apart, if you think about decision making, there has been majorly two big debates. One group has always been arguing that hot cognition or emotion leads us to make worse or bad decisions because we are not able to think through it. In fact, if you look at the old biblical example, we have this white angel and the black angel, and both are whispering in our ears, and we have to listen to the good angel and ignore the bad angel, right? And that is shown in almost all religions.
Right.
I mean, this kind of metaphor is used in many, many religions. And that's the essence of moral philosophy or moral decision making, which is what makes humans truly human. So we are able to make the right choices, apparently. And the emotion leads us astray, which means emotion is bad. This is one view. The other view is no, exactly the opposite, which is because emotion has been so fundamental and it has helped us find what is good or bad for me or the environment, it cannot be a bad thing. It always leads us to believing whether this is a right decision or this is not a right decision. And that is one of the major drivers of decision making in a good way. Now, of course, people have always argued against each other. From there, we have Daniel Kahneman, who got the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2002, but he's a psychologist. So he, and before him, there are two other people, Stanovich and West. They have given this idea of two different systems in the brain. One they have called System 1, and one they have called System 2. So System 1 is what is automatic, affective, emotional, intuitive, and fast. And System 2 is what is slow, deliberative, it takes more time, and accordingly it is less emotional. And what we know now is none of these systems work alone. There are tasks which are predominantly done by an emotional system, and there are tasks which are predominantly done by a less emotional system. I don't say emotional and non-emotional, I say less emotional and more emotional. So we have a more emotional system taking care of certain tasks, and we have a less emotional system taking care of certain tasks, depending on the task, the context, and my goal. Because decision making, or rather any choice or any action, has to be goal oriented. Sometimes the goals are explicit, sometimes they're implicit, sometimes they are in the near future, sometimes far away in the future, but there has to be a goal, otherwise you're doing random behavior. So when you have a context sensitive goal, depending on the task and the goal, you would have a more emotional system take care of it. So for example, when you're seeing a movie, or when you're tasting a new dessert, or when you are meeting an old friend, maybe the first time you saw each other in this interview, you would have perhaps a more emotional system taking charge. That doesn't mean the other system is sleeping. It's also contributing, but the contribution is less.
Okay.
But now, let's say we start to solve a quadratic equation. That is a task which does not require so much of emotional. So it is some task which requires less emotional. So for those tasks, you would have a different system take care. But again, the emotion system is not sleeping, because once you get stuck in the quadratic equation solving part, you have a lot of emotional input coming in. So that is how you can think of decision making being constituted by two different systems. One is a more intuitive system and one is a more deliberative system, but both are working in tandem. Certain tasks require more intuitive systems, certain tasks require more deliberative systems. Also, Once we start getting better and better at the task, and we know the task, in a much better way, it's possible that we start off being more deliberative, but after a lot of practice, it converts to more intuitive. That is what happens with experts. So one fascinating interview by Sachin Tendulkar had asked him, "Do you know how you hit the ball, especially with Shoaib Akhtar?" And he said, "I have no idea." Now, can you believe that Sachin Tendulkar has no idea how he hits the ball? Okay? This this has been the core debate in decision making. There is one group of people, like Malcolm Gladwell and all, who has written a book called Blink, who would say experts just do it; they just blink, right? But they don't know, so which means it's driven by unconscious thought.
Okay.
There are others who would say, no, it's not possible that experts don't know. They just cannot verbalize it. They cannot explain it, but they obviously know it. They have the knowledge in their head. That is why the bat is being held at a specific angle and not some other angle. So the knowledge or the understanding part cannot always come from asking people. You have to observe their action or their actual decision, not hypothetical choices, not interviews, not asking how do I do it or how do I decide. Most people will say I have no idea, but that is not to say that there is no information processing happening, or it's completely driven by voodoo or unconscious thing or a black box which I have no idea about, or it's completely emotional. It's just that for experts, they get better and better at the task. So good, like how you walk today. If I ask you how do you walk, perhaps you will say I have no idea. But that doesn't mean that there's a very very complex information processing happening at muscular level and skeletal level, and also the brain level for the motor signals to send the right signals for your feet. So it's just that we have got better at learning how to walk. And similarly, we might get better at learning how to hit the ball. We might get better at learning to judge a person. We might be able to get better at deciding on a financial investment decision. All of this are decisions in the real world, in the real time, which has a large aspect of intuition and a large aspect of deliberation. But depending on how much good I am at that task, I might hinge more on the deliberative system or I might hinge more on the intuitive system. But I am always in this continuum and they are not completely separate. They cannot be separated out. They both have to contribute. It's just that depending on the context, one contribution is more and one contribution is less.
So, in a sense, if I were to summarize this, I would have to say that emotions and critical thinking ability both play a part in all our decisions, but just the levels of it differ based on what we are doing. And like you said, experts don't really know how well they're doing something because it's become second nature to them. It's something they don't have to focus on anymore. It just their system takes over. And I think walking is, I think, something which is really overlooked by us because it's so intuitive for all of us. Where in fact, if we were to program robots to do it, it's so hard. I mean, I think that's a really good example, which I think everybody can understand, or rather cannot see unless told to them.
Yes.
Yeah, and
that is how almost all decision making tasks, the way I have tried to understand decision making is you always have to perhaps think of outcomes. It's very hard to think of decisions without thinking of outcomes. In fact, even when you have to, let's say, decide a time for an interview like this,
right,
there is so much of thing that's happening at the back end that you always have to figure out what could be the outcome, potential outcomes, also things that can go awry, like the network issues or some other random meeting coming up in each of our lives.
right,
Or it could be a simple thing like deciding which ice cream I want to have. That also I have to project the kind of experiences I would have about having this ice cream at that specific price with that kind of a wrapper, maybe along with somebody I am or not alone with somebody, in front of somebody, not in front of somebody. So there's all of these task specific contexts which we always have to focus on, which are based on the outcome. And one single outcome that again philosophically has been there in our culture and in the more recent Western culture is this sense of gain and loss. So gain and loss is also related to pleasure and pain. So one philosopher had said that I am riding a chariot driven by two horses. One is a pleasure horse and one is a pain horse. All our life, we are essentially trying to control those two horses. And I feel all decision making is about gains and losses. And you have to weigh the gain versus the loss for every single thing. Sometimes it might not be obvious, sometimes I might not know it. But at the same time, I have to know it, or I have to use some projection of it to be able to actually make the decision. Once you start seeing life or every single action as a contention between gain and loss, I think it simplifies our ability to characterize any decision making and also study the information aspect of it and hopefully eventually computationally model it. Because once the robotic example you said about walking, unless we go and try to model it on a computer or a robot, we don't know the clear dynamics of it.
Right.
Only when we want to convert it to a machine, we have to spell every single detail out. One problem in psychology I have seen or I have found is we have too much of things in the air. The detailing of the processes is too much in English language, and English language is very bad. It is very, very hard to understand. It's one of the hardest things to understand. So, in the bad in that sense, bad in the sense of a stimuli, it's very difficult to understand. But once you convert it to non-linguistic or mathematical formulations, you have to pin it down. And then you know that I actually understand something when I'm able to precisely define something. You can't do it for everything. So if you want to write an equation for love, some people have tried to do it. Till now, they have been unsuccessful. Or an equation for consciousness.
Try to write an equation for love.
Yes, there has been quite a lot of attempts. One by a mathematician who has tried to come up with it and worked really seriously hard on it. But there has also been attempts to kind of model love in robots, especially in the humanoid robots. Sophia has been the latest where it at least tries to fake love or show love. In the movie, there's AI as a movie by Steven Spielberg, where a small robot David falls in love with his or its caretaker mother. So we have always been obsessed with love, and I think love is one of the most fascinating things that is around us, and it can happen across species. We know that with dogs, with robots, with toys. Of course, it can happen within species also. Uh, but if we have to convert it to exact mathematical equations, people have failed till now. So I'm not saying that every single psychological term has to be converted to precision to be able to model it. I think it's as of now we don't know how to do it, but there are also things that we have been able to do mathematically, or we have been able to do model mathematically. And I think we should try to do more and more of it because that is what gives precision about that term itself. And decision making is one thing where there has been quite some recent attempts. So we have worked on loss aversion for a long time between how people value gains versus losses. And now there are some people who are, including myself, who are trying to write computer programs which have a neural network which models how people think about gains and losses. So we have to understand a decision psychologically as a behavioral level. We have to understand it at a neuronal level, how the brains make the decision about gain and loss, and then we have to model it on a computer, either based on a brain model of computation or on any other model of computation, where we precisely say how exactly did they compute the gain versus the loss and eventually to it. That is what I think we have to strive towards more and more in decision making, because the more we understand decision making and understand decision making in the real world sense, the more we are going to be able to characterize people. We are also going to be able to help people, and eventually, the more and more we help people, that is where the value of any education or any academia comes, because at the end we are living in a society, and if we are not doing something for people, um, then we are doing something, but we should do something more so that it is of and for people.
Definitely, definitely. Well, that was actually a wonderful way to just like showcase or the future of this field in terms of understanding cognition, of where cognition can lead to. Because I personally believe, or rather, hey, even movies believe that artificial intelligence and feelings in robots is the way to go into the future. But it's wonderfully put by us in the sense like how we have to break down how we are thinking, not just in terms of understanding what's happening inside, but also breaking them down into equations, like love equation, which is pretty fascinating to me. And trying to apply that into future future things like in terms of AI or even in terms of even our robotics, to see how that can be used as a model per se. But one thing which really intrigued me in your answer was you used that analogy of chariot with two horses. Now we had a previous interview with Dr. Milan Pandya. He was here to talk about critical thinking. And so he used that analogy to describe how one is a logical horse and the other one is the emotional horse. And so I see that most people in critical thinking and psychology use that analogy a lot. So this is a wonderful commonality, and in terms of explaining how it's always a balance between two,
Yes.
especially yeah. Please go on.
Sorry. So, it's a good example that you cited. So that is exactly the view that I was trying to argue against, where you have these two horses and those two horses are different horses. And that is how it has always been used in psychology and to some extent even in philosophy. But that is the view that we have to break now, and we know that based on biology. So the more recent biological inputs to cognitive science has been one major input, I think, has been to show that how emotion and cognition is so intertwined that it's almost impossible to think of them as two separate things. So the logic and the less logical or the more logical analogy is a good analogy to think about systems. But in the real world, when we do things, they are not different. In fact, they perhaps just go into each other. But it's slightly different from the pain and pleasure example, because for the pain and pleasure, they are different. There is hardly anything that you can say that this is both pain and pleasure. Well, there are still some stuff like that, but the possible stuff of the world, which are both painful and pleasurable, is very less compared to ones which are clearly pleasurable and clearly painful. So from that kind of an angle, I was saying that, and similarly, there are less things which are both a gain and a loss compared to things which are clearly a gain and clearly a loss. So for me, the horses are for pain and pleasure, and on which you can also put the words gain and loss to be able to characterize a decision. Not so much, but I'm sure that there are many people who have used this horse example to talk of binaries, because eventually all of us, what you are saying are there are two systems or dual systems or dual processes, and sometimes they are walking in separate directions, sometimes maybe they are walking in the same direction. So dual process idea has been predominant in whole of psychology and many other areas too. I just want to add one more thing about the AI comment of yours. I think
Yeah.
that's that's a very interesting comment, and also thing that I hear a lot, especially in technical universities and schools. Everybody wants to enroll in AI courses. They're always oversubscribed, and most people want to enroll in AI courses either to get a job or to build something cool. And among the cool things, it's about emotions. So there is a lot of interest to build emotions in robots. And of course, Steven Spielberg is a great example of how you can entice people to do it. But my comment really is that the focus of students and researchers should not really be on building AI. It should be on building a society where humans and AI coexist. So my most recent research is called dot decision research. So that dot is about technology, and what I'm trying to say is there is no way we will be able to decide without technology. Every single decision we are taking is kind of entwined with technology. But eventually, what we have to realize is, of course, unless the singularity is clear or the doomsday is true, we will always be existing as humans.
Right.
And we have to exist with the machines or with the technology with us. So the crucial part is what kind of technology is acceptable to humans. Those are the technologies which will remain, or those are the ones which will hit the market and stay in the market. So it's very important to study more of the interaction between humans and AI than only humans or only AI. So those psychologists who study only humans, I think, is missing a large part of the modern world, which is the technology and AI. Those who are focusing only on technology and AI is missing the world that we always were, which was us. So the clear interest, I think, has to be on development of systems on AI, which will be for humans, because we have to realize that this AI has to exist within the human community. And that, I think, very less research or centers are focusing on. Mostly they are taking either this or that. But personally, I believe that is the need of the hour. There are some which are doing it already. So there's a Psychology of Technology Institute, I think, at Stanford. There's also an interest in IIT Delhi to develop something called Technology, Cognition, and Society program. There's already one existing at MIT called something like the Science, Technology, and Society. There's few in Germany. There's one in Max Planck in Berlin. So there are clearly a lot of interest in human and technology interactions. And that, I think, will be fruitful to do. So once we have teams which are interdisciplinary, where we have engineers, psychologists, computer scientists, neuroscientists all come together and try to say how exactly are we going to build something which will be of use, then that is where we will be able to work on something which will be of direct implications and direct use to society.
Well, what can I say? So in this interview, it started with cognitive science, and then we took it all the way through, like what happens, and then the future of cognitive science, and that was wonderful for me to hear. And I'm pretty sure the viewers will feel the same way as well, because we got a whole holistic view in sense of where it is now, where it was, the discrepancies or the misconceptions, and what the future of this field could be. So, well, that for me is a wonderful interview to be a part of. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for doing this with us.
Thank you very much for contacting me and calling me. And I hope, within half an hour I did some justice to the field. It's always risky to say how the field has developed or will develop. It's a responsibility, being an academic person. But yeah, so whatever I could say in half an hour, I think some of that will be useful to some people. And I'm sure that the interest in cognition is going to grow more and more, and we would have people from many disciplines coming together to understand it, whether it is about a bacteria or a tree or a human or an AI. We should do more and more.
Definitely. Thank you so much for being on this. Thank you for that. So that concludes the interview for today. And if you take a look at the interview, we started with cognition as a term, and then we ended with cognition of what it can be in the future. And for some reason, the future is to my right. But regardless of that, you understood the scope of cognition as a field, not just in terms of psychology, but also in terms of neuroscience. It's a vast field and in desperate need of people to go in and study and learn more about it. Because trust me, there's never a close-ended answer for any of these questions we have so far. And most importantly, if you do figure out the love equation, please do share it to me. And to, hey, not just me, to all the single boys around the world. We desperately need it. But more than that, I really hope you enjoyed this video and saw the scope of the field and also understood a little bit more of what cognition is. And hey, you could potentially be the guy who makes AI have feelings. So, thank you so much for watching this episode today. I really hope you did like it. So please do like, share and subscribe. And if you did not like the video, well then you hurt my feelings. So please do like, share and subscribe. Thank you so much.